Now we're going to talk about a band that between their first album and their second album lost a member and dramatically changed their sound and their approach to how they would make records. They decided they would go out in an orchestral direction and that they would always put out more or less concept albums. Were they ahead of their time? Yeah, they sure were. And in fact, they were one of the first groups to play a musical instrument and even turn the Beatles onto this instrument. Yes, I'm talking about the Moody Blues. Are you ready to go now? Well, then, let's drop the needle. The band that became the Moody Blues actually started in Birmingham, England in 1958, called El Riot and the Rebels. The two original members were Ray Thomas on vocals and harmonica and John Lodge on bass. Obviously, they needed something more to fill out their sound. In 1963, Mike Pinder joined them on keyboards. But also in 1963, they broke up because John Lodge decided he was going to college. Then in 1964, Thomas and Pinder recruited a couple of new members, Graham Edge on drums, and a guitarist named Denny Lane. The band started out calling themselves M&B5, which was an obvious ploy to get sponsorship from Mitchell's and Butler's Brewery. But that sponsorship never really happened. So then the band decided to change their name, and they became the Moody Blues. When they got to London in 1964, they actually got a record contract with a label that leased albums to Decca Records. Their first single was called Steal Your Heart Away. It was backed by a Lane Pinder original, Lose Your Money, But Don't Lose Your Mind. Yeah, they lost their money. The single didn't chart. But their next single hit the big time. This was an amazing song, sung really mightily by Denny Lane, and it's called Go Now. It's their only number one hit in the UK, but it also hit number 10 in the US. About this time, the Moody Blues got a new producer. His name was Denny Cordell, and he went on not only to produce the Moody Blues, but to produce Joe Cocker, Leon Russell, where he and Leon formed Shelter Records, and even Tom Petty. In 1965, the Moodies released their first album, which is called The Magnificent Moodies, but in the United States it's retitled after their hit single, Go Now. Besides the big hit Go Now, this album contains a couple of songs written by Denny Lane and Mike Pinder. Let Me Go, True Story, and From the Bottom of My Heart. But this album doesn't sound anything like what the sound of the Moody Blues will evolve into. And the back of the album contains a poem written by Donovan. Donovan writes, "Here we sit in a warm black room. The whining silence is the stage. Mad marionettes dancing in the pitch. Then the coolness came. The sounds of blues came mellow rolling. It moved me to somewhere else. The Moody Blues turned me on to their music that night. Their writing has all the sensitiveness and feeling that makes music cool to listen to. The tracks on this LP will show you the sort of scene they have got going. You will probably call it contemporary blues. It could be if you want it to be, but it doesn't matter. Just let it pass through you." And with that, the Moody Blues were hitting the big time. They had a launch party for the album, and included in the guest list were Paul McCartney and George Harrison. But they had a problem. After the party, they discovered that they owed the venue for the drinks and the use of the venue and so on, and their record company had absconded with all of their money. Obviously, they needed another record label. So the Moodies signed with Decca in the UK and London Records in the US and went in search of a new manager. And guess who they got? They got Brian Epstein. Yeah, you might remember him. He was also at that time managing the Beatles. As a result of that, they became the support band for the last tour that the Beatles ever did in the UK. And this is where Paul McCartney became friends with Denny Laine. And of course, after Denny left the Moodies, then years later, he would join up with Paul and Linda McCartney to form Wings. But things are changing inside the Moodies. Their original bassist, Warwick, decides he's leaving, so they hire a new guy, Clark, on bass. But then, all of a sudden, he decides he's leaving, as does Denny Laine. And when Denny Laine leaves, Brian Epstein announces that he is no longer going to manage the Moody Blues. So that leaves the Moodies as a trio, with Thomas, Pinder, and Edge. They decide they'll bring John Lodge back on bass and vocals, and then they hire Justin Hayward on guitar and vocals to round out their sound. Now, at first, the new band just continued to play the blues that they had been playing, but without Denny Laine's strong vocal, they were struggling. And that's when Justin Hayward came into his own with his songwriting. So all of a sudden, the Moodies started to change their sound. Justin writes a single called Fly Me High, which wasn't a hit, but was a hit with underground radio. I remember playing it a lot in Los Angeles. It was kind of a combination of some folk music and some early psychedelia. It's a great song. In 1967, the Moodies released a single called Love and Beauty. And it's not a hit, but it does retain a little piece of musical history. It's the first time that they used an instrument called a mellotron. What's a mellotron, you ask? It's an electromagnetic musical instrument which was developed in their hometown of Birmingham, England in 1963 by a company called Streatley Electronics, and Mike Pinder worked there, and he was introduced to the mellotron at their offices. The instrument uses a keyboard to play samples of analog audio tape. You press a key and the tape loop runs. I guess you could call it kind of an early sampling machine, or maybe even an early synthesizer. Mike Pinder fell in love with this instrument and decided to use it extensively on Moody Blues recordings and to add that to their sound. And then he goes on to say that he introduced John Lennon and Paul McCartney to the mellotron. And of course, they made great use of it, particularly in the opening of the song, Strawberry Fields Forever. The Beatles producer, George Martin, did not like the mellotron. He said it was a Neanderthal piano that had impregnated a keyboard. But nonetheless, John and Paul and the other Beatles did like it, and they used it extensively in Magical Mystery Tour and the recording on the White Album. And of course, Paul McCartney continues to use the mellotron today in his solo recordings. And in fact, if you check on YouTube, there is a great video where Paul is in Abbey Road Studios explaining how the mellotron works. Then something very fortuitous happens to the Moody Blues. Their contract with Decca is about to expire. But Decca has created a new label called Durham Records. Durham Records were trying to figure out how to improve stereo recordings. They created a new technique called Decca Panoramic Sound. This concept allowed for more space between the instruments, rendering the sounds softer to the ear. Earlier stereo recordings of popular music had mixed signals to the hard left, center, or hard right only. Decca initially conceived Durham Records as an outlet for this new sound technique. And so they approached the Moody Blues and say, if you guys will do a rock and roll version of a classical song, a suite, that we can put on an album using this new stereo technology, we will relieve all of the debt that you have with the record company. Now, of course, that was an offer the Moodys could not refuse. The deal was they were to make a rock version of Antonioni Dvorak's New World Symphony, specifically to showcase this new stereo sound format. But the Moodys had a different idea. Now, as usual, I've created a Spotify playlist where you can listen to some of the songs that I've talked about in this episode. And here's the link, and I'll also put it in the comments below. In our next episode, we'll talk about how this decision by the Moody Blues to ignore what their record company wanted them to do helped them create a totally new sound for the band and a new direction, which they would keep for years. Thanks for watching, and until next time, keep it rocking. If you liked this episode, hit the like button, and you can also leave me a comment down below, and I'll respond to you. If you subscribe, we'll let you know when future episodes come out.